history project of Historic Madison Incorporated, I, Lorraine Orchard, am talking with Delma Woodburn, D as in David, E-L-M-A, Woodburn, W-O-O-D-B-U-R-N. We're at her home at 211 North Prospect in Madison. It is appropriate that we should be interviewing Delma for Historic Madison because on January 30, 1976, she was presented by Historic Madison with an honorary membership for significant and outstanding contributions in researching and preserving Madison's past history and encouraging future appreciation of this valuable heritage. I'm reading from the document. Delma was in distinguished company when she received that award, for there were 12 who were honored for their work on the history of Madison and the University of Wisconsin. Among the award winners were E. B. Fred, former president of the University of Wisconsin, who was honored for his historical publications, A University Remembers, and the role of the Wisconsin Alumni Research Foundation in the support of research at the University of Wisconsin. Another award winner, Merle Curti, for writing with Vernon Karstensen the 2-volume history, The University of Wisconsin, 1848 to 1925, and for his outstanding teaching career at the university. A third award winner was William J. Sherrick, S-C-H-E-R-E-C-K, for helping establish Historic Madison and for his accomplishments as supervisor of local history for the State Historical Society. The fourth, Lee Molenhoff, for serving as a member of the City Landmarks Commission since 1971 and as its chairman for the preceding 2.5 years. Anna and Philip Fox were awarded for preserving their family's historic home, Fox Hall, south of Madison, and for researching and collecting early city history. Frank Custer was honored for reporting on historical subjects for the Capital Times and for his work on a biography of the late publisher William T. Evu. Next on the list was our Delma D. Woodburn, who was president of the Dane County Historical Society and who helped establish the Dane County Records Center, which is certainly important to us these days, for that's where our records are kept. Robert B. L. Murphy, for 3 decades of service as curator of the State Historical Society. Bernard Schwab, who was then the director of the Madison Public Library and the first treasurer of Historic Madison. He was honored for providing library space for collections of historic material. Janet S. Ela, for 2 books, The Madison Art Association, 1901 to 1951, and Free and Public, 100 Years with the Madison Public Library. The last person on the list, Lynn Watrous Hamill, for her many contributions to Historic Madison and her book, A Taste of Old Madison. Delma, I've talked with you before. We've been on committees together, and you make an interesting remark that I can't help asking you about. When you talk about your childhood, you say, I was always on the fringe in Madison. Well, when I realized all of your honors and your great participation in Madison activities, I can't understand what you mean by that. So why do you tell me you were on the fringe? For example, weren't you born in Madison, or didn't you grow up here?
Well, the reason I was on the fringe was because I was a farm girl, born on a farm 20 miles from Madison, not in Madison. I was born on the family farm in Springdale, Dane County, and I was a fourth generation Wisconsinite.
Well, then, how did your association with Madison begin?
Well, my father was Father John S. Donald served in the state legislature from 1902 to 1912, which met 3 or 4 months every other winter. So until I started to country school, the family, meaning my dad, mother, and grandmother, and me, spent those winter months in Madison.
Well, what would you do? Would you rent a house in Madison and then go back to your farm?
That's exactly what we did. And the first place I remember, we had lived on Broome Street above a grocery store, but I don't remember that one. The first one I remember was the winter of 1904 when I was 5 years old. We lived in a flat on Webster Street near the corner of East Mifflin Street. I remember the water tower on East Washington Avenue and the fire station in the block east of the avenue. I remember watching the horse-drawn fire engines with smoke and sparks flying out the chimney stacks as they rushed by the house. I used to get up at night and watch them.
Well, I imagine most of the neighbors did. I've heard enough about these fire engines to know there's a great deal of lore associated with them. Do you remember any particular stories or exciting events or anything about these fire engines? Can you think of anything?
Well, as a matter of fact, a little later when I could read, I remember reading a story that was making the rounds about that time.
Good.
Okay, well, if you want to hear it,
I do.
It goes.
I do.
Pat and Mike, their first day in New York, fresh out of Ireland, staying in a hotel. Pat woke up when he heard the bells of a fire engine out the window. Mike, wake up. They're moving hell and 2 loads have gone by already.
Well,
I also remember being given 5 cents to spend at the bargain basement of the fair store, which was located where the YWCA is now.
What was that, a general kind of store?
It was a general sort of a store.
Mm-hmm. But a bargain basement.
A bargain basement.
Good.
To spend my 5 cents.
Good. Well, where else did you live? I suppose you lived in various places then, because you couldn't always get the same place, could you, to rent?
That's right. We lived in so many different places as a result of this every other year business. Well, the next one, really, that I remember, we had a flat at 137 Langdon Street next to the Phi Gamma Delta fraternity house, which faced Henry Street. From January to June, I attended 5th grade in the Washington School.
Well, you and many other Madisonians, I've talked with quite a few during these interviews, and Washington School appears and reappears. It must have been a wonderfully exciting school. People speak of it with affection.
Well, I think the most exciting experience I had was attending my first symphony orchestra concert.
At when you were
in the 5th grade.
Oh my goodness!
Well, then and you speak about the other people going to the Washington School. That winter, in the 6th grade, were the girls known as the Henry Street Bunch. Julia Hanks, Helen Gill, Mary Parkinson, Seda Buckmaster, Eleanor Riley. I guess there were a few others, but I don't remember just which ones they were. Anyway, they went all through high school, university together, and most of them have lived here in Madison since. They were as outstanding then as they always have been since.
It's good to have those names. They are very familiar names.
Well, anyway, when my father became Secretary of State in 1912, we lived for a year and a half at 11 East Gilman Street. And I went to what was then the last year of the Richmond Academy, which was operated by the Richmond sisters.
Oh, do you know Monona Nafziger, don't you?
Oh, yes.
She was Monona Hamilton, and I can't tell you which relatives, did you know this, are Richmonds.
I didn't know that.
And they operated this school in Richmond Hill in South Madison. I think was their old home site.
I think you're right. That I know.
And I know that school is somehow connected with her family.
Well, they decided that they would turn their school over to the university as sort of an experimental school, and it became the Wisconsin High School. And in the fall of 1914, now this I go back to places we've lived in Madison.
Yes.
In the fall of 1914, we moved into a stone house at 14 West Johnson Street, which was just opposite the Madison High School. On one side of us lived Dr. Bentz and his family, and the two girls were friends. That was Jessie and Carol.
He was a dentist, wasn't he?
He was a dentist. He was a friend of my father's, too.
Uh-huh.
On the other side of us, in a stone house, almost matching the one we rented, lived the two MacArthur sisters.
Well, MacArthur.
Okay.
All right, tell me.
All right.
Am I right?
You're right.
Oh.
Their brothers became World War I, General Douglas MacArthur.
And World War II in the Philippines.
Well, then it was World War II instead of World War I.
Right, in the Philippines, when he said, "I shall return."
That's the one.
And that's Douglas in
That's
Madison.
right.
Now, I didn't know that.
Well, anyway, this is my memory of the MacArthur sisters.
Mm-hmm.
On summer afternoons, they'd sit on their porch, all dressed up, always wearing hats and gloves.
Oh, no. Do you have any other particular memories of that period in your life?
Well, somewhere in there. Now, I think probably in 1910 or 1911, I remember going to Professor Cale's dancing school.
Oh, well, that was...
Now, Professor Cale was the father of Leo Cale.
And he started it then, I suppose Professor Cale started it.
Okay, oh yes,
Did he?
indeed.
Uh-huh.
And, of course, he was so well known. These parties that they had, like in the Capitol or university parties or whatever, he was usually master of ceremonies, and he always saw to it that people were dancing in the proper fashion.
Good, good.
And people had a great deal of respect for him. He was just a master of ceremonies, really, at these parties.
I think the Cale School of Dancing still continues. I'm not positive, but I think that I see that every once in a while in the paper.
Yeah, I just haven't kept up with it, really.
K-E-H-L, for the record.
That's correct.
Mm-hmm. Well, any other recollections from high school? Have you told us who some of your classmates were?
Yes.
In high school?
Well, no,
You
let's
mentioned
see.
the others, but they were Washington School, I think.
Okay, but no, I think what I mentioned was that the Wisconsin High School moved from where it was on the corner of Gilman Street and State Street when the Richmonds had it. They moved from that building to its University Avenue building, which is right in near where what is or used to be the nurses' dormitory.
Right.
In the fall, that was in the fall of 1913, I believe, and so I went with the high school, and then there we had our little girlfriends, which included my closest friend Polly, Rachel Commons. Her father was Professor John R. Commons. Well known, and Agnes Sarles, and her father was the student pastor of the Congregational Church, and Kitty, Catherine Apple, father's family, for, well, 2 generations before him, I guess, had a grocery store on the Near East Side in Charlotte Peabody. Her father was a state architect. Alice Monroe was one of the girls, and her father, I think, was a professor. And others who were all campfire girls together. And our social activities really centered around Ho-Chira.
Oh, can you spell that? Or
well, okay, it's spelled H-O, and then
dash,
or Chira, C-H-E-E, and then another one, R-A.
Never heard of it, I'm sorry to say. Where and what was that?
Well, that was a bungalow that was built by Professor and Mrs. Commons on a hill which they call Dale Heights.
Any connection with this Dale Heights Presbyterian Church?
Well,
near Middleton?
The church is located on the heights.
I see.
And in those days, in those early days, Mrs. Commons had a horse and buggy and drove out there to a cottage which they lived in summers before they built their house. But they were this, Polly and our young friends used to enjoy so many social activities out there. So that was called the Heights Group. Well, no, that was Polly's group. And let me see, what did I start out? Oh,
you were telling me about your Wisconsin High friends.
Oh, yes. Well,
and your social activities around Ho-Chira.
Well, so we really had the high school years were always very enjoyable. And then there was a group from the Heights called the Heights Group, and there again I was always on the fringe because I didn't live out here. But some of the young people in that group were Martha Buell, Gertrude Knowlton, and the Winchell girls. And the boys, Harold Leidy, Stuart Tenor, Eugene Maurer, Frank Ross, and they were joined at the Commons' house parties by Carl Holfeld, Whitney Seymour, who became a distinguished attorney in New York, by the way.
And I'm recognizing a lot of these last names.
Well, another one of the boys was Art Canan, and his sister, it was Marge Canan Rawlings, who wrote The Yearling.
Oh.
And then Morris Togstead was another one of the boys. And Morris enlisted very early in World War I, and he was killed in action.
Oh. Delma, do you have any other recollections from this era of your life, when you were still living on Johnson Street? Is there anything particular, in addition to your high school recollections, that you have?
That fall, of course, I was a freshman at the university, and I had classes in Bascom Hall, and what I would like to report was that I was in Bascom Hall at the time the dome burned.
Oh my goodness!
But
in the fall.
That was October 10th, 1916.
Oh well, tell me. Tell us.
Well, okay. There's a story that goes with this. You see, my father was Secretary of State, and his office was in the west wing of the Capitol, facing down State Street. And he was sitting at his desk in his office when he saw fire in the dome at Bascom Main Hall. It was Main Hall called then, I think. And so Dad called Charlie Heil, who was a friend of his, and he was the fire chief of Madison, and he said, "Charlie, did you know that Main Hall was on fire?" Well, Charlie didn't know it, so it turned out my father turned in the fire alarm.
Oh.
Well, anyway, I was in a history class on the main floor of Bascom Hall, or Main Hall, room 165, and I watched we were the last class to evacuate from the building, and I watched the fire from Lincoln Terrace as a freshman.
I didn't know much about this fire. I guess I knew that Bascom Hall had a fire about then, but I didn't know much. Did it just burn the dome? Or?
It just burned the dome.
Well, that was fortunate.
And it was very fortunate on that.
Well, Delma, before the fire engine arrived, did the students do anything to try to put out that fire, or did they just exit, or what went on? What do you remember?
Well, at that point, I didn't remember anything, but since I have heard that the students, in their zeal to extinguish the fire, hooked every available hose to hydrants near the hall, dangerously lowering the water pressure and almost losing the building before the firemen arrived.
Oh, my goodness.
In time to save the building.
Did they take out any furniture or records or anything, or what went on?
The story goes that they decided they ought to get all the office furniture and files and papers and everything out of President Van Heist's office, and they started dumping them on the grass, and I understand that President Van Heist was hopping around mad as a hatter.
Oh!
Now this, I understand, was recalled by the late Albert Gallistel, former director of physical plant planning.
Well, he probably knew. Do you have any idea about how many students were in the university at that time?
Well, there were around 5,000.
Well, that was a lot. It was a good-sized school then.
Right.
And Bascom was about how old?
Well, the Bascom Hall was about 57 years old, because it was built in August of 1859.
Venerable
building. By the way, was our farmhouse was built.
Oh, well. Well, that's a good college recollection. I assume that you finished college here in Madison, then the University of Wisconsin. Did you graduate, or did you not graduate, or?
Well, I guess I should make one comment in here. See, I was a freshman in 1916, and the World War I was in progress at that point, and along came 1918, and the university was in a turmoil. Most of the men from the campus were in service, and the result was that students were really in an upset situation, including me. And so my father was tapped to go over to France with the YMCA, and I elected to drop out of school and go to business college in the hope that I might contribute to the war effort. So 1918 and 19, I started in Miss Brown's Business College in Milwaukee, but that only lasted for 6 weeks because the flu was so prevalent that they closed the business college. And my mother was ill with pneumonia, and so it ended up that the year that I took off was taking care of Mother, and so we came back to Madison from California in the spring of 1919. You see, the armistice had been signed in 1918, and my father was expecting to come home in August of that year, so he told Mother if she happened to find a house that she wanted, maybe she should get it so that he'd have a place to come back to.
In Madison?
In Madison. So the result was that Mother saw this house at 211 North Prospect Avenue, which she liked the looks of and found that it was on the market. You know, let's see, he was in the...
This is a lovely home. It looks so adaptable for family living. I'm sure you have many happy memories here. There's beautiful woodwork, rooms of comfortable dimension, and I see family treasures around here, furniture and everything. I'm sure that you have many ties. Do you happen to know who built it or from whom your family bought the home?
Yes, as a matter of fact, this was built by a university professor. I think he was in the economics department, T.K. Erdahl.
How do you spell that?
It's U-R-D-A-H-L.
Good. Well,
And he occupied the house only a very short time because he went later to, I think it was Ohio. And that was why the house came on the market. It had been rented to a music teacher. When Mother and I looked at the house in May or June of 1919, there were 5 pianos in the house.
oh. You moved into the house then. Then did you go to the university when you lived here?
Well, yes, but the family took over the house as soon as my father got back from France in August of 1918, and it just happened that one of the friends that I had been having a picnic with wanted to see the house, so I said, "Okay, we'll go look at the house," and he was intrigued by the music room that the Erdals had built in the lower part of the house. He said, "You know, this would be a great place for students to live." And Mother and Dad said, "Well, we were wondering what we were going to do about it." So Hardy Stay Home was the first one that got interested in it, and he gathered together 5 boys, and Mother and Dad adapted the area to these 5 boys. One of them being Ralph Knapsinger.
Oh, Monona Hamilton's husband, not at that time.
Well, yeah, they started dating later, but he was a long-time head of the journalism department here. They were very fine. They were very fine young people, really. And upstairs with me lived a girl who graduated and was a secretary in one of the departments. So we became the attic bats, and the boys downstairs became cavemen. They also called themselves troglodytes, and they carried on a very lively social activities downstairs with Mr. Donald and Mother D as official chaperones.
Oh, wonderful. Well, it was like having brothers, wasn't it?
Oh,
And
really?
you were their sisters and good friends?
I had never had brothers, and they all took me over and worked me over. They were a marvelous set of brothers to have.
Oh, good. Well, then you did graduate.
Well, yeah, I was a sophomore that year, so I had 2 years in the house and graduated in 1921.
What did you major in?
Well, economics, under Professor Commons, as a matter of fact.
Good. All right. Well, I obviously know you married James Woodburn. When did that occur?
Well, okay, now, maybe you should have a little story about that. Facing on Kendall Avenue was a house. His backyard adjoined this house, and Professor and Mrs. Ogg lived there. Well, in the summers when they went on vacation, they often invited friends to occupy the house, take care of their cat, and they invited in, this would be the summer of 1920, I guess, 1919, maybe 20. Professor Woodburn from Indiana University, who'd been a colleague of Professor Ogg's. So they became our next-door neighbors. And it was through Mrs. Ogg that I met Mrs. Woodburn, and Mrs. Woodburn introduced me to her son James, and so James Woodburn became my Jim Woodburn.
Oh, wonderful.
And so that you see what that would have been, I guess, in 20, in 21. And then there came year 22, and eventually we were married here in this house in September of 23.
And you have 2 sons.
Well, from here we went to Pullman, Washington, And one of our sons was born in the state of Washington. Then we went to Ann Arbor, where Jim got his PhD degree, and our other son was born in Ann Arbor.
And Jim ultimately came back here.
And eventually, after some years at Washington State College, we came back here, and Jim has been on the engineering faculty ever since 1937.
In conclusion, I would like to say that we did not, in earlier tapes, mention the facts that Mrs. Woodman served as president of both the Wisconsin Friends of Our Native Landscape and the Wisconsin Roadside Council. Those are two groups that we did mention earlier. And of course, she was chairman of the Dane County Historical Society for 16 years. During that same period, she was chairman of the Madison Civics Club, as we did mention earlier. On October 3, 1976, in the Wisconsin State Journal's Know Your Madisonian feature, Delma Woodburn was the person written up with a love. Thus, having been chairman of the Madison Civics Club, and then being featured in Know Your Madisonian, Mrs. Woodburn was pleased that she had finally become a full-fledged Madisonian.
Madisonian. We wanted to leave out the full-fledged, proper.
Real Madisonian. Delma, as a University of Wisconsin student, I'm sure you had many exciting times, but let's be serious for a moment. What did you major in?
Well, I majored in political economy, and Professor John R. Commons was my major professor, and I wrote my thesis on the history of employers' welfare work.
And what was your minor? Or didn't you have a minor?
Oh, I had a minor in speech under Gertrude Johnson.
Oh my, you had eminent professors. Their names certainly are known in Wisconsin history. Well, did you, what do you particularly remember about recreation when you were in college?
Well, I have one story that I used to enjoy. Now, as part of our speech program, we really put on programs in the Fuller Opera House. But before that, you might be interested in a story about the Fuller Opera House. During the early years, high school years and college years, there was a third-floor balcony in the Opera House. And anyone could line up hours ahead of a program, and for 25 cents, get a seat in the third-floor balcony. And you could hear such people as Maud Adams and Otis Skinner. And so we all swarmed up to the balcony. Well, of course, they didn't provide programs for us. The people down below paid 25 cents for a program. So we went equipped with strings with pins or something on the end of them. And people that were real generous would pin a program onto our string, and we would share the programs with our group in the balcony.
Oh, wait, excuse me.
Well, anyway, the year I was a freshman, that was fine. I went rush. That was called going rush. I went rush. And my Chi Omega supervisor, Mother Chi Omega, was there, and she was terrifically embarrassed by this pledge fishing for programs from the balcony. And afterwards, she took me to task for it. Well, so then I explained what we had been doing, and that this was considered really the thing to do.
Good. Where was this Fuller Opera House?
Oh, well, that was up on the square, and it was right in there next to where the Woolworth store is now.
Let's see.
It was facing the Capitol on the square. Between that and that building, I think they call 30 on the square.
Yes.
And it was right next door to the City Hall, which was the City Hall at that point.
Mifflin Street.
Mifflin Street.
Right.
Okay.
Well, what other recreation do you remember from college days?
There was one that I thought would be interesting for this report. In those days, the young people, Madison young people, used to do tobogganing on Pinckney Street Hill, and that was really a terrific toboggan slide. And but you see, by that time, we were living up here in the Heights, and we had a very congenial group that centered around my roommate, Harriet Goodwin, and the boys that lived in the cave. So you might be interested to know that there was a report in the Capital Times about a toboggan party which we had. And maybe you would like to know. I will tell you about our Heights toboggan slide.
Oh, good.
Okay.
Good.
All right. We started at the top on Prospect Avenue in front of Dean Tenor's house, the top of the hill. We came down to Princeton Avenue and turned left. And then we came down to University Avenue. Well, we had guards parked out there to stop the horses and the autos while we went across University Avenue. Well, down there at that corner of Princeton and University, there also was a metal water tank for watering the horses back in those days. Well, anyway, we continued our toboggan slide over the railroad, and we made a sharp turn to the right and ended up down by the stock pavilion.
That was a long slide.
That was a long slide, and we continued that until somebody ran into that fence down there, and we decided it was a little too hazardous.
Oh. Right.
Well,
do you have some of those names in that Capital Times article?
Yes. Here, my roommate was Harriet Goodwin, and she was a co-hostess to the party. And included was Blanche Field, Emily Dijon. Now, she was from France. Ethel Vingy, Frances Ellen Tucker, Grace Bitterman, Emily Daller from Belgium. And the boys, William T. Hayes, Ralph Nafzinger, J. Arlington Anderson, Edward Anderson, and Hardy Stehome. And all lived at the cave at that point.
What fun.
And, of course, we'd come back to the house and have hot chocolate.
Oh, good. Well, when did you meet your husband then? I don't see his name on that list.
Oh, yes. Well, okay, now that came... Also, that came in this was in 1919. That came in the summer of 1919. Now, I should explain that our house at 211 was part of the Dr. Ely estate. And it, so that when they set this aside for a house, actually the north side of the house was bordered by the Knowlton's house, by Professor Frederick Ogg's house on Kendall Avenue, and on Lathrop Street, the back door of the E.B. Skinner's house and Professor Harrington's house bordered on our backyard. Well, okay. Now, anyway, this summer, the Oggs, Professor Ogg, as a matter of fact, was a friend of Professor Woodburn from Indiana University. And the Woodburns came up to Madison to spend a vacation with their son, James Woodburn, who was here on the Forest Products Laboratory. And Mrs. Ogg invited Mother and me over at the house to meet Mrs. Woodburn and their daughter. And so That was real good, but I decided that I should return their courtesy by asking the daughter to go swimming with me. So I appeared at the Ox front door and rang the doorbell, and Mrs. Woodburn came to the door, and back of her was this tall, dark-haired, brown-eyed son, and she introduced me to Jim.
Oh.
And from there on, we became part of the Professor Commons and Mrs. Commons and Polly Commons' group that used to meet at the Irving cafeteria.
That was when? Which year?
Now that was these years from 1919 through 1920 and 21. And of course it was at this Irving's cafeteria. This group that met there used to be called the Hobos. We did a great many things together, canoeing and picnicking and partying. And Catherine Ely, who married Mark Ingram,
yes,
was a niece of Belle Crow, who operated the Irving cafeteria.
Where was that now?
Now that was down. Well, it was this, well, you'll have to tell me. It was this cross street there. And as a matter of fact, the Gamma Phi house was on one corner and the Theta house was on the other corner.
Right in the campus area.
Right there in the campus area.
Not Sterling Court?
Sterling Court, that was it. Okay.
Okay.
Well, so we used to meet for lunch there, and Catherine Ely was part of our group, and Mark Ingram was part of it too, and of course, as a student in the economics department, I used to go out to the Commonses to their Friday nighters, which was a big evening for students in the economics department. Well, I'm off my story here.
That's interesting. Well,
I'm off my story here.
Well, then you graduated.
Oh yes. Well, all right.
In
1921.
21. Okay. All right. Did you work at all, or were you married immediately, or what did you do?
You see, I really hadn't been dating Jim at that point. He had other interests, and I did too. But anyway, that first year after graduating, I spent a year of training in Marshall Fields in Chicago. And then finally, the next year, I came back to Madison and in the Industrial Commission as a woman deputy.
My goodness. What were your particular responsibilities then?
Well, as a woman deputy, the department was in charge of the women and children's affairs.
That sounds quite modern.
Well,
it really was, wasn't it?
It really was. But anyway, it was during that year that I really don't think I earned my money, because Jim and I began dating that winter, and we became engaged in the spring.
Right.
And we're married in September of 23.
And
here in our house at 211. Right
how
here.
Wonderful.
And oh yes, Mother and Dad put on a wonderful wedding for us here. In fact, they included the people from the farm, and the people from the farm got a great kick at these people that were wearing their tuxedos and with their white vests and everything. Well, anyway.
Where did you go after you were married then?
Well, the Professor and Mrs. Commons were going to spend the year in Washington, D.C., and they asked us if we would take care of their house and dog for them. And so they gave us their old Ford to drive. So Jim and I started our married life out at Professor Commons' house out at Hochira, which is now Now, where is that Presbyterian church on University Avenue out there?
Dale Heights.
On Dale Heights.
Right.
That Dale Heights was named Dale Heights because Mrs. Commons's maiden name was Dale.
I see.
And they had had a cottage out there before they built their house at the top of the hill.
For heaven's sake.
That's
south of Middleton.
That's south of Middleton.
And on the west side of University Avenue.
Correct.
Right.
Well, anyway, we were married in September, and Jim by that time was working for the Northwestern Railroad as an engineer. And one of the early depressions, the company got pretty pushed, and he was the youngest man on the road, so he was the one that was laid off, like on the 1st of December. Well, it was one of the lucky things that happened, because that next semester he was invited to teach mathematics at Indiana University. He'd grown up in Bloomington. His father had been chairman of the history department at Indiana University. So we had a wonderful year, half year, in Bloomington. And in the fall, Jim had a position offered to him at Washington State College in Pullman, Washington.
Was that mathematics or
no,
engineering?
That was in the Department of Civil Engineering. And so while we were at Pullman, our son Jim was born in 1925.
All right.
Well, then Jim decided that he needed to get more background for his hydraulics engineering. So we went to Ann Arbor for him to get his PhD degree.
Good.
And it was there that our son Bob was born.
What year is that?
Well, that was in 1928.
1928, okay.
He got his PhD in 29, and then he was given a traveling fellowship to visit hydraulic laboratories in Germany and other places in Europe. So there we went for a perfectly wonderful year with our two little boys.
Oh, you were fortunate.
Oh, it was a wonderful experience.
What do you remember particularly that you enjoyed?
Well, we especially enjoyed attending opera in Munich and enjoying the marvelous concerts that we attended.
Did you dangle programs or go fish for programs, or didn't you do that in Germany?
No, in Germany we didn't do that. But I tell you, we were still on a budget, and so we used to sit in the balcony, and we would even take Stehplatz. That means standing place.
Good, good.
Okay. Well, all right.
Then
after the year, we returned to Pullman, Washington in the fall of 1930.
All right. Now, when did you come back to Madison then?
Well, in the spring of 1937, Dean Chynoweth came out to Pullman and invited Jim to come to the university as chairman of the hydraulics and sanitary department because they needed a professor that had a PhD degree.
Well, wasn't he glad he had one?
Well, we debated quite a while. We loved it out in the Northwest, and we'd never intended to come back to the Middle West. But anyway, we came back for the fall semester of 1937, came back in September.
And where did you live then when you came back?
Well, during our Pullman years in 1934, my father died. And Mother had been in the house here to 11, but she had decided to make her home in Florida with her two sisters. So when we came back to Madison, she was delighted to rent 211 to us. And at that point, our sons, Bob was in 5th grade, and Jim was in 6th grade in Randall School.
Right down the street here.
Right down the street, very conveniently.
Oh,
and because we were connected with the university, it was logical for them to attend the university high school.
You picked up ties, I suppose, in Madison, or were your friends around, or did you have to, how was that to move back?
Well, yeah, well, that's a good question. We got back here, and once again, I was on the fringe of the university and on the fringe of Madison, and I'll explain. The new young faculty people were much younger than I was, for one thing. And then people figured that, of course, since I'd lived in Madison, I knew a lot of people and had a lot of friends. Well, as a matter of fact, my university friends and my Madison friends had, most of them, moved elsewhere. So I felt sort of out of place.
Well,
but what I should say is that one of my special friends here was Catherine Ely, and one of Jim's special friends. As a matter of fact, he had roomed with Mark Ingram, who later became Dean of the Letters and Science School, and he and Catherine, of course, were married, and well, I can't remember just which year that was that they were married now.
All right. I know you had many busy, happy days as a faculty wife, but I'd like to ask you about farms. I realize that you have managed farms, and when did all this start? It's about this time, isn't it? Or do I have the wrong time?
Well, no, this is a very good question, a good time to ask that question, for the reason that Jim was very busy with his university work. Our boys were very much absorbed with their high school work, and I was just not a part of anything. Well, anyway, that winter of 1937, my grandmother died and left the family sweet farm to me. And Mother, of course, had inherited her life estate in the Donald Farm and the Rockview Farm from my father. And she was having problems operating those farms because she was living most of the time in Florida.
Now, where are these farms? Are they all near each other?
Oh, yes. They're in the town of Springdale, and they are all adjoining. We had, together there are 630 acres, maybe. And should I explain a little bit more about those farms?
I think that's interesting.
Well, you see, when I began, well, what I should say, okay, well, anyway, I know the 3 farms were operated as dairy farms, supporting 3 families, so that farming, should I back up and say that when I began looking after these farms, I realized that I just simply didn't know enough about farming. And so I started, I was advised to take the university farm short course.
Oh, good.
Which I did, and I found it very, very helpful to me. And so, anyway, now I back up to the farms. And what I should say is that these farms were just never a hobby. They were of business, and have been all these years for the family. And the farms from that, you see, was we came through all of the changes in farming that were typical of the period, from horses to tractors, from kerosene lamps to electricity, from windmills and outdoor privies to running water and indoor plumbing and in the houses and drinking cups in the barns. But my responsibilities for the farms could be patterned for my free daytime hours so that they didn't interfere with either our faculty or farm activity, or family activities.
Wonderful. What sort of family activities then did your family enjoy?
Well, one thing, since this is for this Madison, Historic Madison, I should comment here that, for instance, one of the things we did was to dance with Cosmos Club.
Oh, yes.
And while we were dancing with Cosmos Club, our boys danced with the University High School Cotillion Club. And we could go to their high school football and basketball games, and we could go to the university games. Enjoyed very much going to them.
Can you remember who some of the people in the Cosmos Club were?
Oh, well, as a matter of fact, I have here a 1941 and 42 list. Well, okay, some of the ones I particularly remember: the Henry Algans, the Benedicts, the Freeman Browns, the Oscar Christensens, Obie Combs, the W.S. Cottinghams, the E.M. Douglases, the Harold and Mrs. Engel, the Connie Elviums, Louis Barbach. Do you want some more?
Yes, this is
okay.
fun. These are all familiar names.
Okay, the Oscar Loftsgardens, Dr. and Mrs. Leonard, Nelson, Mrs. Lerdow, the G.W. Longeneckers, the Fred Rissers, and the C.B. Stumps. And by the way, I'm still playing bridge with Mrs. Stump at the Kiwanis Bridge Club.
Good.
John Shields, and you remembered, you said the Thompsons.
Yes.
From Dartmouth Road and Sherwood
Yes.
Hills. And
in fact, many of these names are familiar. This was really town and gown, wasn't it?
It really was.
It's a mixture. As you say those names, I can see it isn't all faculty or all town.
Right. That's right.
What fun. And your children, then, you said, were dancing with a cotillion club.
Cotillion club. This was a dancing club that was in the Wisconsin High School. It was sponsored by the mothers of the high school students.
Who were some of those mothers?
Well, okay. And this particular year that I happened to have the lunch list, which was in 1943, with Mrs. Wilbur Grant, Mrs. James Payton, Mrs. R.O. Morris, Mrs. Robert Connor, Mrs. R.O. Langlois, Mrs. Carl Mose, Mrs. Howard Nethercutt, Mrs. Howard Snyder, Mrs. J. Newton Sisk, Bruno Stein, and Mrs. Warner Taylor were the hostesses that year.
What fun. I wish that young people these days danced as much as that generation and our generation did. Maybe they'll resume it. I think they miss a lot when they don't.
Well, they are, but you know, it's interesting. Some students that I know at this point are taking ballroom dancing.
Good, good. I'm glad. All right.
Well,
now you had then time for your family and travel. I know you've loved to travel.
Well,
Did your family take trips?
we did a great deal of traveling together. We went back to Pullman several times, and we used to spend summers camping together in Canada and Lake Sagamaga. And we also thoroughly enjoyed the concerts that came to the university, and were very much interested when Madison began organizing its Civic Music Association and the opera, the Symphony Orchestra Group and the Opera League.
Good. All right. Now, this short course was terribly important to you, I realize. And did that lead you, in addition to helping you manage farms, as you still do, I understand, to any other particular contacts or activities?
Oh. Yes. Well, as part of, because we own these farms in the country, we became part of a group that was organized here in Madison, really by the Dane County agent, Bill Clark, and this group of Madison people who owned farms and lived in Madison were organized in what they call the City Farmers Club.
Who can you tell me who some of those people were? I think it's interesting historically to know who.
Well, this group met for dinner once a month, and we enjoyed each other very much. And I happen to have a 1952 Capital Times newspaper clipping here with pictures of the members of the City Farmers. Now, I should explain that I was a member of City Farmer, and my husband at this point was a spouse.
Oh, now that's a switch.
Okay, well, all right. Now here we were.
I think I see one woman in the picture.
Oh, you see more than one woman in the picture.
Yes, I see.
You see Mrs. F.L. Chapman. You see Mrs. Philip F. LaFollette, and you see Delma Woodburn.
Sure enough. All right. And then who are some of the men?
Well, okay.
Or all of them, really. There aren't so many.
All of them here. Well, Professor James G. Fuller, Dwayne Bowman, Richard Ela, Ralph Jacobs, Herb Pfister from Mount Horeb, John Craig, who was a farm manager, Frank Cairns, the Dane County